Leave this boardroom now. You useless housewife.
The moment the water splashed across her face in the middle of the boardroom, just enough to shock the room and ruin the crisp collar of her blazer while her mother-in-law stood there smiling like it had been an accident, was the exact moment the $10 billion company they all bragged about stopped being their family empire and became the stage for their downfall. No one in that glass tower knew it yet. Not her husband, who stood near the head of the long conference table, laughing too loudly because he wanted his mother's cruelty to sound normal. Not his sister, who covered her mouth with one manicured hand and shook with delighted disbelief, as if humiliation were entertainment. Not his father, who leaned back in his leather chair with the smugness of a man who had spent his whole life mistaking inheritance for superiority. And certainly not his mother, who still held the half-empty glass in her hand and looked at the wet woman in front of her as though dignity were a thing poor people borrowed and rich families like theirs got to snatch back whenever they pleased. But the woman standing there, drenched, silent, and painfully still, was not poor. She was not powerless, and she was not simply the wife they had dragged into that room to make an example of. Her name was Simone Whittaker Carter, and every single person laughing at her worked for the company she owned. The boardroom sat 42 floors above downtown, wrapped in glass, steel, and quiet arrogance. The skyline spread behind them in sharp silver lines, the kind of view that made people sit straighter and speak as if their voices deserved to rise over a city. Inside, the room smelled faintly of espresso, polished wood, and the expensive perfume of people who thought money made them untouchable. At the center stood the long walnut conference table where Carter Holdings had hosted acquisitions, succession meetings, expansion briefings, and family strategy sessions for decades. The Carters loved that table. They loved what it represented: power, control, legacy. They especially loved the story they told themselves about it, that everything sitting on that floor, every office, every stock certificate, every signature, and every salary existed because the Carter family built it with discipline, intelligence, and bloodline. That story had holes in it, but no one in that room had spent much time looking for them, especially not Brandon Carter. Brandon was Simone's husband. 35 years old, sharp jaw, smooth voice, polished confidence, and just enough charm to make arrogance look like leadership if you met him too early in the day. He worked as Executive Vice President of Operations, a title he wore like a crown and quoted like a prophecy. People at the company called him the heir without saying the word out loud. His mother, Lorraine Carter, called him the future of this family every chance she got. His father, Vernon Carter, did not use words so easily, but his approval sat in the way he looked at Brandon during meetings, like a man studying what he believed was his finest investment. And Simone had spent 4 years married into that family, quietly watching all of them confuse access with ownership. When she first met Brandon, he did not know who she was, not really. He knew her as Simone, intelligent, reserved, elegant without trying too hard, the woman who asked sharp questions and never over-explained herself. He knew she had gone to business school. He knew she had once worked in strategy consulting. He knew her father had been successful. He never pushed further because men like Brandon only investigate deeply when they sense competition, and Simone had learned years ago how to dim the visible edges of her life so men would reveal themselves before they realized they were being seen. Her father, Elijah Whittaker, had taught her that. He had built Whittaker Capital from almost nothing into a silent empire, then turned that empire into controlling positions across logistics, energy, infrastructure, media, and finally Carter Holdings itself. He was the kind of billionaire whose name rarely appeared in headlines, but whose signatures rearranged industries. 3 years ago, when deteriorating health forced him to simplify succession, he placed the controlling ownership of Whittaker Capital and all its holdings into Simone's hands. That included the majority structure that quietly owned Carter Holdings. It had been done through trusts, layered holding entities, and board protections that made the company appear publicly family-run while privately answerable to one final authority: Simone. Only 4 people knew the full truth: her father before he died, the company's external counsel, the chairman emeritus, and Simone herself. Brandon was not one of them, neither was Lorraine, and that is why the room now looked the way it did. Simone stood near the far end of the table in a navy suit with a white blouse, her hair swept neatly behind one ear, a leather portfolio resting in front of her. She had arrived 10 minutes early to review materials for the quarterly family governance meeting, a meeting Lorraine had insisted Simone attend for once because, as she put it in front of 2 assistants, wives should at least learn how the machine works if they're going to enjoy the ride. Simone had said nothing then. She said very little in rooms where insecure people needed noise to feel tall. But today, something in the air felt especially poisonous. Lorraine had entered already irritated, her silver-gray suit cut sharp, her heels ticking across the floor like punctuation marks of entitlement. She placed her bag at the head of the table and began complaining immediately about numbers she did not understand and executives she did not respect. Brandon followed behind her, laughing in all the right places, performing loyalty with the ease of a man who had been rewarded for it his entire life. Behind them came his sister, Nicole, bright, stylish, and vicious in the polished social way that let her insult you with a smile wide enough to suggest she was joking if you were weak enough to object. Vernon arrived last, carrying no documents, no laptop, no visible concern, because men like Vernon believed their importance should enter the room before they did and keep speaking after they left. The tone of the meeting turned ugly before it properly began. Lorraine asked Simone why she was reviewing the financial deck so carefully when most of it was above lifestyle concerns. Nicole laughed. Brandon smirked. Vernon adjusted his cufflinks and said, "Let her read, it probably makes her feel included." The comments were not new, that was the problem. The Carters had been trimming Simone in little public gestures for years. At dinners, they asked what she did all day now after she stepped back from formal consulting work. At holidays, they joked that Brandon married peace, not pressure, which really meant they liked imagining her soft and economically irrelevant. At company events, Lorraine introduced her not as a strategist, not as a board advisor, not as anything serious at all, but as our Brandon's wife, with a small laugh after wife that always made it sound like a decorative role she had barely earned. Brandon never defended her. That hurt more than Lorraine's tone, more than Nicole's grin, more than Vernon's dismissiveness. Because a stranger's contempt is one thing, a husband's participation is another. Still, Simone endured it, not because she lacked courage, but because she possessed timing, and timing had served her well. Every quarter she read the reports before Brandon ever saw them. Every major move in the company passed through a system that ultimately landed at her desk under different letterhead. Every time Brandon strutted into the house celebrating his influence in the company, Simone already knew whether his recommendations had been approved, softened, or quietly denied. She watched him build a self-image on a structure he did not know belonged to her. And sometimes, late at night, when he slept beside her, talking in dreams about legacy and succession, she would stare at the ceiling and wonder whether he would love her differently if he knew. Today, she was about to stop wondering. The first 30 minutes of the meeting moved through expansion summaries and debt restructuring projections. A few external directors attended by video, their faces silent in wall-mounted screens. Lorraine dominated the room, interrupting anyone who spoke too long. Brandon tried to sound measured, occasionally leaning over Simone's shoulder with patronizing remarks like, "You don't need to worry about that section," or "It's mostly internal governance." Each time, Simone simply nodded once and kept reading. That irritated him more than open disagreement would have. Brandon liked reaction, he liked his control to leave fingerprints. Lorraine eventually stopped the discussion entirely and turned to Simone. "Since you're already here," she said, "why don't you tell us what exactly you think you qualify you to sit in meetings like this?"
Nicole laughed before Simone could answer. "Oh, Mama, don't do her like that," she said, grinning. "She probably thinks being married to Brandon makes her part of strategy." Brandon leaned back in his chair and smiled. That would explain a lot. The room loosened with their laughter. Only Simone remained still. She lifted her gaze from the report and looked directly at Lorraine. "I'm here because I was invited," she said calmly. Lorraine clicked her tongue. "That's not an answer. It is the one I chose." Nicole covered her mouth with one manicured hand and shook with delighted disbelief, as if humiliation were entertainment. Brandon shook his head. "Always with the little corporate answers. That consultant voice never leaves you, huh?" Simone turned one page in the report. Across the table, one of the external directors on video briefly looked down, as if he did not want to be visibly associated with what was unfolding. He knew who she was. Two of them did. The third suspected. None of them spoke. Not yet. Lorraine rose from her seat then, not in outrage, but in performance. She took her glass of water in one hand and walked slowly around the table
until she stood near Simone's chair. The room quieted, expectant. Lorraine smiled down at her with that brittle sweetness older women sometimes use when cruelty has become their preferred dialect. "You know what your problem is, Simone," she said, gesturing lightly with the glass. "You carry yourself like someone who matters in this company." Brandon laughed. Nicole laughed too. Vernon gave a low, approving hum. Simone did not move. Lorraine tilted the glass slightly as she spoke, and the motion looked almost casual, almost careless, until the water arced suddenly from the rim and splashed across Simone's cheek, her blouse, her collar, and the front of her navy blazer. It was not the whole glass. It was enough. Enough to humiliate. Enough to shock. Enough to make the room jump and then, horrifically, break into laughter. Lorraine did not gasp. She did not apologize. She simply looked at the spreading dampness on Simone's blazer, smiled, and said, "Oh well, maybe now you'll cool down and remember where you're sitting." Nicole doubled over laughing. Brandon bent forward with both hands on the table, shaking with a laugh too hard and too eager to be mistaken for discomfort. Vernon pointed once, openly entertained. Even one of the assistants at the door looked away too late. Simone did not wipe her face immediately. She did not blink away the water. She did not shout. She stood there with droplets sliding down her cheek and into the collar of her blouse, while the family she had married into laughed as if public humiliation were a bonding exercise. And in that exact second, the final soft excuse she had kept alive for Brandon died. Because Brandon was not laughing nervously. He was not trapped. He was enjoying this. Lorraine set the half-empty glass down on the table. "You should be embarrassed," she said, still smiling, "not because of the water, because you keep forgetting you are only here because of my son." Brandon laughed. That part. Simone slowly reached for the linen napkin beside her notebook and pressed it once against her cheek. The room's laughter faded in uneven fragments. People expected anger now, or tears, or an exit. Instead, Simone folded the damp napkin neatly and placed it beside her folder. Then she looked first at Lorraine, then at Brandon, then at every face in that room that had mistaken her silence for surrender. When she spoke, her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "I wanted to be sure," she said. Lorraine's smile tightened. Be sure of what? Simone's eyes moved back to Brandon. Whether any of you had enough judgment to stop before making this impossible to undo. The laughter died completely. Brandon frowned. What is that supposed to mean? Simone turned toward the screen at the far wall, where the external directors sat in separate windows, watching too carefully now. "Mr. Harlan," she said to the oldest of the three. "Would you be kind enough to confirm whether this meeting is being recorded for governance review?" The man cleared his throat. "Yes," he said carefully, "as required." Lorraine looked around the room, suddenly irritated. "What are you doing?" Simone ignored her. She reached into her portfolio and removed a thin black envelope, placing it on the table with calm precision. Then she looked at Brandon one more time. There was no anger in her face now, only clarity. "3 years ago," she said, "when your family company began losing control of its debt ratios and nearly exposed itself during the East Coast expansion, a holding structure was quietly activated to protect ownership and strategic authority." Brandon's face shifted. Lorraine scoffed. "Simone, stop pretending you understand things you were never part of." Simone slid the envelope toward the center of the table. "No," she said. "You stop pretending I wasn't either." Vernon frowned deeply now. "What is that?" "Board confirmation, updated this morning, with copies for legal, governance, and succession review." Nicole looked at Brandon, no longer smiling. Brandon stared at the envelope, then at her wet blazer, then at her face. Something in him began to understand before his mind had caught up. Simone opened the envelope. Inside were 3 documents and a letter on company letterhead bearing the signature of the chairman Emeritus. She laid them flat on the table. "At 12 years of age," she said evenly, "my father built the structure that now owns majority interest in Carter Holdings." Lorraine laughed once too sharply. "No." Simone looked up. "Yes." Brandon's mouth parted, but no sound came out. Vernon stood from his chair. "Whitaker," he said slowly. "Elijah Whitaker was your father?" Simone nodded. "He was." Nicole took a small step backward. Lorraine looked at Brandon as if the answer might be in his face, but Brandon had none to give. Because Brandon had never asked about her father in any serious way. He knew the man had been wealthy, connected, private. He never asked how wealthy, never asked connected to what. And now the room seemed to fold inward under the weight of everything he had chosen not to know. Simone placed one finger on the first document. "This confirms that Whitaker Capital's controlling structure became majority owner of Carter Holdings 3 years ago." The second, "This confirms that upon my father's death, final authority transferred to me." The third, "This confirms that as of this morning, the board has approved a governance review of all senior family executives, effective immediately." Lorraine stared at her as if she was hearing a ghost. Brandon's voice came out low and raw. "You own the company?" Simone met his eyes. "Yes." The room did not explode. That was the strange part. No one shouted first. No one moved. Because real power rarely announces itself with chaos. It announces itself with silence, then leaves everyone else to make noise around it. The city stretched cold and brilliant behind the glass walls. Water still dampened Simone's collar. Lorraine's half-empty glass sat at the center of the table like evidence, and the family who just laughed at her stood in the boardroom of the company they thought they owned, staring at the woman they had humiliated without realizing she was the only one in that room with the power to keep any of them there. The silence in the boardroom after Simone's words felt heavier than any shouting could have been, because laughter had died so suddenly that the room now seemed to echo with the memory of it. Lorraine Carter stood frozen beside the table, where she had only seconds earlier been smiling with superiority, her hand still resting near the glass she had used to accidentally splash water across Simone's face. Brandon stared at the documents on the table as if the ink might rearrange itself and undo what he had just heard. Nicole's grin had vanished completely, replaced by a tight nervousness that made her look suddenly younger and far less confident. Vernon Carter remained standing, his posture stiff, his eyes locked on Simone with the kind of attention powerful men reserve for moments when the world shifts beneath their feet. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound in the room came from the soft hum of the city outside the glass walls and the faint electronic buzz of the video conference screens where 3 external board members watched carefully. They had not laughed. They had not reacted. They had simply observed. Simone stood calmly near the end of the table, water still darkening the fabric of her blazer, but she made no effort to wipe it away again because the humiliation had already served its purpose. Lorraine was the first to break the silence. "That's ridiculous," she said sharply, though her voice carried far less certainty than before. She looked at Vernon. "Vernon, tell her this is ridiculous." Vernon did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the table and looked down at the documents Simone had laid out. His eyes moved slowly over the signatures and official stamps. Then he looked up again. "You said Whitaker Capital," he said quietly. "Yes," Simone replied. His expression changed in a way only people who truly understand power can recognize. Vernon Carter knew that name. Whitaker Capital was not loud in the press, but inside corporate circles it was a giant, a silent investor that appeared in major acquisitions without warning and vanished just as quietly once control had shifted. "And Elijah Whitaker," Vernon continued slowly, "was your father?" "Yes." Nicole let out a small breath of disbelief. Brandon still had not moved. His eyes remained on the documents. "You're saying," he said quietly, "that the company belongs to you." Simone met his gaze. "The controlling share belongs to Whitaker Capital," she said calmly. "And Whitaker Capital belongs to you," Brandon replied. "Yes." Lorraine scoffed loudly, trying to push the moment back into disbelief. "That's nonsense," she snapped. "If that were true, we would know." Simone looked at her. "You were not meant to know." Nicole crossed her arms tightly. "That doesn't make any sense." "It makes perfect sense," Simone replied. "Ownership and management are not always the same thing." Vernon slowly lowered himself into his chair again, the movement far more cautious than his earlier confidence. "Why hide it?" he asked. Simone folded her hands lightly on the table. "Because the company needed stability. 3 years ago, Carter Holdings was carrying debt exposure that made it vulnerable during the expansion. My father stepped in to secure the structure quietly so the company would survive." Brandon looked up now, confusion mixing with shock. "You're saying we were rescued?" Simone did not soften her tone. "Yes." Nicole looked at Brandon quickly. "You knew about this?" Brandon shook his head slowly. "No." Lorraine's face flushed with anger. "So we were just supposed to keep running the company while you secretly watched us like some kind of puppet master?" Simone tilted her head slightly. "You were supposed to keep running the company professionally." Lorraine laughed harshly. "And now you're going to pretend you're in charge?" Simone did not react to the insult. Instead, she slid the final document slightly closer to the center of the table. "The board approved a governance review this morning," she said calmly. Vernon's eyes moved back to the paper. "A review of what?" "Leadership performance," Simone replied. Nicole looked alarmed. "You're talking about firing people." "I'm talking about evaluating people." Brandon finally pushed back from his chair and stood up. His voice was tight. "You're serious about this?" "Yes." He stared at her. "So all this time you were just pretending?" Simone met his gaze steadily. "No, I was observing." Lorraine pointed angrily at the water stains on Simone's blazer. "And what about that?" she demanded. Simone glanced down briefly. "The water?"
Yes, Lorraine snapped. Simone looked back at her. That was unfortunate. Nicole gave a small, nervous laugh that quickly died when no one else joined her. Lorraine's voice sharpened. You expect us to believe you're suddenly the boss because you brought some papers? Simone calmly lifted the letter bearing the chairman's signature. This letter confirms my authority, she said calmly. Vernon leaned forward and read part of the page. His expression darkened. It's legitimate, he said quietly. Lorraine turned toward him sharply. What? It's legitimate, Vernon repeated. The words landed like a weight in the room. Nicole's eyes widened. Brandon looked from Vernon back to Simone. You're not joking. No. The reality of the situation began to settle slowly over the family. 3 years of decisions, 3 years of board approvals, 3 years of corporate strategy, and all of it had ultimately passed through Simone's control. Lorraine sank slowly into her chair. This is unbelievable. Simone looked around the room calmly. What is unbelievable, she said quietly, is that none of you ever thought to ask who actually owned the company you were so proud of. Brandon rubbed his forehead. Why didn't you tell me? Simone studied him carefully before answering. Because I wanted to know who you were without it. Nicole shifted nervously. This is crazy. Simone turned slightly toward the video screens where the external directors were still watching. Gentlemen, she said calmly, would you confirm the board's approval of the review? One of them nodded. The approval was unanimous. Lorraine looked from one face to another in disbelief. You planned this? No, Simone replied. You created this. She glanced briefly at the glass still sitting on the table. Today simply revealed it. The room fell silent again, because the power in the room had shifted completely. Just an hour earlier, the Carter family believed they controlled everything in that building. Now they were staring at the one person who actually did. And the woman they had mocked minutes earlier was the same woman who could decide whether any of them kept their positions by the end of the week. Simone straightened slightly. The governance review begins immediately. Brandon looked at her again, his voice quieter now. You're really going to do this? Simone held his gaze. Yes. Outside the glass walls, the city continued moving, completely unaware that the Carter family empire had just discovered it was no longer theirs.
The silence that settled over the boardroom after Simone announced the governance review was heavier than the laughter that had filled the room earlier, because now every person sitting at that table understood that the balance of power had shifted, and there was no simple way to pretend otherwise. Lorraine Carter stared at Simone with a mixture of disbelief and anger that made her jaw tighten, the confidence she had carried into the room earlier now draining slowly as reality settled in. Brandon remained standing beside his chair, his mind still trying to rearrange the last 10 minutes into something that made sense. Nicole looked from one face to another, clearly realizing that the situation had moved far beyond the family teasing and casual arrogance they had always used to keep Simone in her place. Vernon Carter, who had spent his life understanding how power worked, was the only one in the room who had already accepted what had happened. He leaned forward slowly and looked directly at Simone. If what you are saying is true, Vernon said carefully, then you have the authority to make major decisions about this company. Simone met her gaze without hesitation. Yes, she replied. Lorraine slammed her hand on the table. This is insane, she snapped. You expect us to believe that this entire company belongs to you now? Simone shook her head slightly. No, she said calmly, it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the holding structure my father created. I simply control it. Nicole let out a quiet breath. That's the same thing. Simone did not argue. Across the table, Brandon finally found his voice again. You should have told me, he said quietly. Simone looked at him. You never asked. The answer hit him harder than he expected. Brandon ran a hand through his hair and stared at the floor for a moment before looking back up. So what happens now? He asked. Simone stepped toward the head of the table where Lorraine had been sitting earlier. The movement was calm, almost casual, but it carried a weight that no one in the room could ignore. She placed both hands lightly on the polished wood surface and looked around the room. What happens now, she said evenly, is that this meeting continues. Lorraine stared at her. You can't be serious. Simone met her eyes. I'm very serious. Nicole leaned back in her chair, suddenly uncomfortable. This whole thing feels like some kind of test. Simone glanced briefly at her. In a way, it is. The video conference screens on the wall flickered slightly as the board members adjusted their cameras. They had been watching everything carefully, saying very little, but their silence carried authority. Simone looked toward them. Gentlemen, she said calmly, you've seen everything that happened in this room. One of the directors nodded slowly. Yes. Simone continued calmly. Then you understand why the governance review cannot wait. Another director spoke. The board agrees. Lorraine turned toward the screens angrily. You can't just sit there and support this. The director's expression remained neutral. Our responsibility is to the company. The words were simple, but they ended the argument before it could even begin. Lorraine leaned back in her chair, clearly furious, but suddenly aware that the room was no longer on her side. Brandon looked at Simone again. What exactly does this review involve? He asked. Simone answered without hesitation. It evaluates leadership performance, financial decisions, and behavior that affects the company's reputation. Nicole shifted in her seat. Behavior? Yes, Simone said. Her eyes moved briefly toward the glass still sitting on the table. Lorraine followed her gaze and looked away quickly. Brandon noticed. He looked at his mother, then back at Simone. You're talking about what just happened. Simone's voice remained calm. I'm talking about professionalism. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of the situation had finally become impossible to ignore. Vernon cleared his throat. If this review is happening, he said slowly, then it should be conducted fairly. Simone nodded. That is the intention. Lorraine scoffed. Fair, she said bitterly. You come into this room hiding who you are for years, and now you want to talk about fairness? Simone looked at her. I hid nothing that affected the company's operation, but today you revealed something that does. Lorraine opened her mouth to argue again, but stopped when she realized the entire room was watching her. The embarrassment of the earlier moment now seemed to be settling heavily on her shoulders. Brandon spoke again, his voice quieter than before. Simone, he said, I need to ask you something. She looked at him. Yes? If today hadn't happened, would you have ever told us the truth? Simone considered the question carefully. Yes, she said finally, but not like this. Nicole leaned forward slightly. Then how? Simone answered simply, when the company was stable enough for the transition to be announced. Vernon nodded once. That would have been the responsible approach. Lorraine looked frustrated. So you were just waiting? Yes. Brandon exhaled slowly, and instead we forced the moment. Simone did not answer. She didn't need to. The room already knew. The quiet realization began spreading across their faces one by one. They had humiliated the one person who actually held the final authority in the company, and they had done it publicly. Lorraine finally spoke again, though her voice had lost most of her earlier arrogance. So what happens to us? Simone straightened slightly. That depends on the review. Nicole looked nervous. You're not going to fire everyone. Simone shook her head. That isn't the goal. Brandon watched her carefully. What is the goal? The goal, Simone said calmly, is to make sure the company is led by people who understand responsibility. Lorraine looked down at the table. For the first time since the meeting began, she seemed unsure of herself. Brandon sat down slowly.
The confidence that had defined him earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet realization that the future of his career now rested with the woman he never took seriously. Simone looked around the room one final time. This meeting will resume tomorrow morning. The board will begin interviews with each executive individually. Nicole nodded slowly. Vernon leaned back in his chair again. Lorraine said nothing. Brandon looked at Simone with a mixture of regret and disbelief. "You really were the most powerful person in this room the entire time," he said quietly. Simone picked up her portfolio from the table. "Yes," she replied. She walked toward the door of the boardroom, stopping briefly before stepping outside. Then she turned back and looked at them all. "The difference," she added calmly, "is that I never needed to prove it." With that, Simone opened the door and walked out into the hallway, leaving the Carter family sitting in stunned silence inside the boardroom of the company they believed was theirs. And for the first time since the company had been founded, they finally understood who truly controlled the empire they worked for.